Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Julia Baird. Coming up, the Treasury Secretary suggests a hike to the GST. An American court gives the green light to more campaign donations. And why did the Tea Party have such contempt for Barack Obama? We will talk with US political scientist Christopher Parker. Our panel tonight, the Chaser's Chaz Licciardello, Helen Rittelmeyer from the Centre for Independent Studies, and the host of 7:30 New South Wales, Quentin Dempster. And of course, you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. First tonight, Coalition MP Arthur Sinodinos has finally fronted the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption. The senator was called to give evidence for an investigation into Australian Water Holdings, a company he once chaired. It's been alleged the Obeid family held a secret shareholding in the business and lobbied the state government on its behalf. Mr Sinodinos told the inquiry today he couldn't recall being warned about AWH and didn't know about a $75,000 donation to the Liberal Party. The senator didn't have too much to tell the media after today's hearing.
What I've attempted to do here today is tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Look, I'm not speculating on the future. The Commission has done its work with me today and I'm keen to go off and have a coffee. I'd chat you all a coffee, but there's too many of you.
ABC court reporter Jamelle Wells was at today's hearing. Jamelle, welcome back to The Drum. Quite an extraordinary day. Arthur Sinodinos was in the box for 6.5 hours. Were there any major revelations?
Well, he revealed today that in his mind he earned his $200,000 a year salary as a board member for Australian Water Holdings, and the ICAC has alleged that he got that salary for about 100 hours a year work. But today the counsel assisting Jeffrey Watson said he estimated it was more like between 25 and 45 hours a year. And Senator Sinodinos was very quick to jump in and say, well, did you include travel time in that? Because he said sometimes it took me 90 minutes to get from one place to another for meetings. And he described how he had coffees with investors and he had lunches near his workplace. And he said he thought it was a fair salary. He also had a lot of problems with his memory today. He was asked repeatedly to recall certain events and amounts of money and things that happened when he was on the board, and he couldn't remember a lot of it. So Jeffrey Watson became really annoyed with him, and at one point Jeffrey Watson said, will you please concentrate? And then the commissioner, I should say, Megan Latham, even jumped in at one point and said, well, let's look at that question again to try to help him remember. For example, he couldn't remember how AWH got into so much financial trouble. He said, I was aware there was a cash flow problem sometimes, but I can't honestly answer in great detail why. And when Jeffrey Watson said to him, well, you were a director, wasn't it your responsibility to know about these things? He said, yes, it was, but I wasn't the only director. And he said, I just knew that AWH was in a dispute with Sydney Water. He said, I discussed it at board level and that was enough.
So what else did he talk about in terms of his diligence before becoming involved at all, as well as execution of his other responsibilities as a director?
Well, he was asked about allegations, for example, that the former Labor Minister Eddie Obeid and his family had a secret stake in AWH, and the ICAC has alleged that the Obeid family had a $3 million stake in the company. He said he knew nothing about that. He was asked, was he warned by the former head of Sydney Water about being associated with AWH, because the former head of Sydney Water, Dr Kerry Schott, had told the inquiry, she warned him, she said these people might be dishonest, so I'd be careful if I were you about being associated with them. He said he couldn't recall that warning, he didn't know anything about it, and he couldn't recall how a donation was made to the New South Wales Liberal Party when he was the Treasurer and also a director at AWH, and the counsel assisting said, oh, come on, you're a director of the company and treasurer for the New South Wales Liberal Party. This amount of $75,000 went from AWH to the Liberal Party. How could you not know that? And he said, I didn't. I wasn't aware of it.
So if he's describing what you're describing is very much a narrowing of what most people would understand the role of a director to be, What was he saying he was there to do? Something he was there to open doors, to kind of introduce people to people? Like, is that what it was about?
Yes, he acknowledged that. He said, I took on the role because I had political connections. He said I could talk to investors, I could drum up business for the company. He said I wanted to move on. I think he called it to transition from being a political advisor. And he said I wanted to move on and move into the business world. And this seemed like the right way for me to do it.
Quentin, what do you think the broader implications of this are for the Liberal Party?
It's still playing out, but we've got to get other lobbyists. As Jamel has described, his Liberal Party connections seem to be important for him to join Australian Water Holdings. It was in dispute with this major public utility, and it wanted a PPP, and Sinodinos was in for an equity stake in that, of which, if they could pull it off, was $10 to $20 million. He was aware of that. He didn't tell Barry O'Farrell, the Premier of New South Wales, when he went to knock on his door and use his political connections to overcome disputes that AWH was having with Sydney Water. Didn't tell him, said, I didn't have to, I don't believe I had to. Right. So this question of the ethics and propriety of influence peddling through appointment, through donations, will go right to the reputation of the New South Wales Liberal Party, the Liberal Party generally. Tony Abbott, you remember, in February on this issue of lobbyists and power brokers using their power for influence peddlers within, he said you can either be a power broker or a lobbyist, you can't be both. The New South Wales branch of the Liberal Party had plenty of lobbyists on the state executive, and that's caused a great deal of ructions because the Liberal Party's integrity is on the line here now. As we've seen in the last 2 years of the exposure of the Australian Labor Party, its integrity was very badly damaged to the point where the voters in a state which had traditionally voted Labor absolutely smashed them at the last state election. And
given the broader implications of what you're talking about, I mean, do you think there needs to be more scrutiny on the lobbying process or on the ministerial accountability question?
Both, because it's this ministerial discretion. Under the Westminster system, you're a Minister of the Crown, you're an honourable minister. Her Majesty the Queen says you're
right,
honourable.
That's exactly right.
Honourable minister. Yes. So we expect that you will exercise your discretion honourably. But the discretion is not codified. And Justice Ip, the former ICAC Commissioner, just retired, made a major recommendation. There's about 28 of them, 30 of them, and he said that the code of conduct, the ministerial code of conduct, should be made applicable to the ICAC Act. It's a New South Wales piece of legislation. Other states would have to look at it. The Commonwealth would have to look at it. So that would mean that the ICAC could check as an external check on the compliance of ministers with their code of conduct. That would mean that ministers would have to say, I saw that lobbyist, yes I did, I took these submissions, I saw these objectors, I took those submissions, and then I exercised my judgment on the merit, particularly if a minister is awarding a substantial contract or being a consent authority for a planning rezoning or anything.
So you're not so much going to doctor some cabinet documents, for example, reversing earlier decisions, as has come up before?
Well, that has also been a major appalling display on the allegations so far that cabinet minutes which were doctored. They didn't go anywhere.
Sorry, Chaz.
While I know everything, I would like to ask a question of the Brains Trust, which is, what is it about New South Wales? It seems a huge coincidence that's New South Wales Labor Party and the New South Wales Liberal Party. What is it about New South Wales?
I suspect there are versions to various degrees of seriousness in every jurisdiction, so let's not go into complete moral panic. This occurs elsewhere.
People did say, what about Queensland not too long ago?
Yes, of course. Dear old Queensland. But the ICAC, which has existed since 1988, has extraordinary powers like a royal commission, but it's also got forensic accountants, it's got IT specialists who can pull stuff off databases, and it can double check. And it has coercive powers, which means it can phone tap, and it can demand your attendance, and it can seize documents.
So is New South Wales better at finding the corruption, mate?
At the moment we are.
There's the big question. Who else needs an ICAC? Yes.
Well, the difficulty with the Criminal Justice Commission in Queensland, Victoria, police corruption has been big, very distressing to the public to see corrupt coppers and everybody fearful of that. But when it goes into political influence peddling how you have an exposure process of very powerful people, it's very problematic.
Right.
I think there'll be an attack on, Julia, I think there'll be an attack on the ICAC now because of its methodology. People wheeled in there, their reputations are destroyed. And there'll be a counterattack. And
just very quickly before we move on, Jamel, now there were some reports that one of my favourite actors, Rob Carlton, who of course played Kerry Packer, was at the hearing today at the ICAC because he's thinking of maybe a mini-series. Did you spot him at all?
Yes, and it doesn't surprise me because the ICAC has all the ingredients of a great mini-series. I mean, you could go for years covering some of its hearings. You've got high drama, you've got the council assisting at the moment, Jeffrey Watson, you've got a new commissioner, Megan Latham, and you've got a parade of the who's who of the Sydney business world and political world, and a public gallery that fills up every day.
The barracks.
Quite. Helen, can you think of anyone who might play some of the key players in this?
I think it's a shame that James Gandolfini is no longer with us because I think he'd make an excellent Sinodinos.
Oh, Sopranos. The Sopranos.
Exactly.
We need to
move on. Yes.
Rob Carlton can play Kerry Packer. He should play all of them. That's the ultimate challenge.
Okay, that'll keep him a little bit busy, so we'll see that in 10 years' time. All right, Jamel, thanks so much for joining us tonight. Now, both Labor and the Coalition have ignored the Treasury Secretary's call to consider lifting the GST. Martin Parkinson says living standards could fall if Australia fails to make tax reforms. He suggested increasing the GST and indexing the fuel excise.
Ultimately, the return to surplus must be underpinned by policy decisions, by individual hard decisions taken by government. If we do not start making these changes, we'll be increasingly vulnerable to the next global crisis, as I said. We will lose out on the opportunities presented by Asia, as I said, and the exceptionalism of this lucky country will become a distant, ironic memory.
Dr Parkinson mentioned broadening the GST base to include areas like health spending, but both the government and the opposition have ruled out any changes.
We're not proposing to change the GST. I'm sure there'll be a continuing debate about tax and tax design and the GST and a broader base and all of those issues, and that's very healthy. But what's important to know is that we don't have any plans to change the GST in that regard. And obviously, that's a question. That would be a very big issue, and it's something that a government would take to an election.
The Labor Party doesn't support increasing the GST. It would fundamentally hit low and middle income earners. We don't support increasing petrol excise. It too would affect people's cost of living. We're up for a debate and a discussion about tax reform. We'll not only be constructive, we'll be proactive in that debate.
Not only constructive but proactive, Helen, but the moment a suggestion is made about the GST, and of course it's been made before, but it's significant that Parkinson's doing it now. Surely we need to be having a discussion about revenue, and do you think the GST should be part of it?
I think absolutely, but it's important that we don't misunderstand what Parkinson said. He absolutely didn't say that a hike in the GST will return us to surplus. He made an interesting comment on the tax mix in Australia and whether we might want to rely more on the GST and less on the income tax. And that's a very interesting question. But whatever the answer to the question of the tax mix, that's not going to answer the larger question of how we get back into a surplus situation. For that, it's going to require hard policy decisions and serious discipline to rein in outlays. And that's not me saying that, that's quoting from Parkinson's speech last night.
Right, but I think that in terms of, we're all having the discussion about the outlays and the spending now, but what should we be doing about the revenue, do you think?
Oh, well, I like Chris Bowen's comment in response to Parkinson's speech. He says we have too many taxes bringing in not enough money. Right. I think that's exactly half right.
Right. Would you agree, Chaz?
Look, I think that we do need to talk about the GST because the hard facts are that in 10 years' time there's going to be $10 billion more spent on the NDIS and the schools reforms, $50 billion more on health, $40 billion more on carers, payments.
It is actually mind-boggling.
That's $100 billion a year extra. More. Now, there's going to be cuts. Like Helen says, there has to be cuts. But on top of that, there also has to be more revenue. Now, people talk about regressive taxes. Sure, find me a tax that isn't regressive, and then we can talk about it if it doesn't wreck the economy. But in the meantime, you need to raise that money somewhere, somehow. And because what's more aggressive than the GST is cutting aged pensions and cutting health and cutting all these things, which is the alternative. Yeah, you're going to have the cuts anyway, but you're going to have more cuts if you don't increase that GST somehow. If you do nothing, there's going to be bracket creep anyway, which is like a 3.5% tax hike on people of $40,000 a year. That's still regressive. It's regressive whatever you do. It's just a case of being financially irresponsible versus financially responsible. So I think we should have that discussion.
Now, do you think, Quentin, that this was really about getting us to think about GST for the next election?
It looks like it's just retail adversarial politics that they both knocked it on the head, even after the Under-Secretary of the Treasury Department bravely has said we've got to discuss the GST. But the other thing is that the Commission of Audit, the government has had that for 6 weeks now, and we still haven't got the benefit of it. They're just orthodox politics in that sense for their own adversarial reasons. Remember, the Rudd government wouldn't put out, and Wayne Swan wouldn't put out, the Ken Henry tax review, the most comprehensive tax review that we've had. And Swan wouldn't allow them to go into the GST in that one either. It's political dynamite. It's toxic if you say, yes, we will consider a tax increase. But I think everybody agrees we've got to have an intelligent debate, and certainly Martin Parkinson tried to say, within our position with Asia, to have an intelligent debate about the tax revenues for Australia so that we're in the best competitive position.
And I think we're going to have an intelligent debate on taxation when the white paper on taxation comes out later this year. But that's going to be after this government has already come out with its first budget. So it's going to be Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey who are setting the agenda and not the white paper, which comes later.
Well, you can understand that, I suppose. They've got, when's the next federal election, 2016? They don't want to make a wrong move, and knocking this on the head straight away has been part of that. But you're right, if we can get some informed debate about it, they both parties may be able to do something after 2016.
Right, OK. Well, environmental campaigners could soon have a tougher time getting out their message. The law currently bans actions that stop someone from buying goods off a third party. But there is an exemption for environmental concerns, as well as consumer protections. The government has asked a review into consumer rules to look at closing the loophole for the environment. Parliamentary Secretary Richard Colbeck wants the laws amended to force environmental campaigns to be truthful. The senator insists the changes wouldn't hurt freedom of speech.
I don't think it inhibits free speech. It just means that you need to be accountable for what you say, and I think that should hold up in any circumstance. If they want to run campaigns, that's fine, but they should be held accountable for the truthfulness of those campaigns, and at the moment they're not.
Chaz, is this a freedom of speech question, or is this just about accuracy?
Well, look, I would argue that anyone who's been in Australia over the last few years and watched some of the political campaigns that have gone on would ask, where's the truth in every other campaign? If you're going to have... I just want to know how you judge what's truthful and what's not, because it's often a very dicey area.
It's a big philosophical question.
Yeah, it
right?
certainly is.
Right.
Well, I'm a very deep person, Julia, but if you can come up with a system where we determine what's truthful and what's not in a way that doesn't inhibit freedom of speech, then I'm all ears. But until then, it sounds to me like a bit of a stalking horse, I'd have to say.
What do you think, Helen? I mean, the protections in place currently sufficient? I mean, you have to be truthful and accurate.
Sure, and I'm certainly sympathetic to the business interests here who believe that we've got an unlevel playing field with environmental groups being given an undue exemption. But it is true that many, when they speak about dishonest campaigns being conducted by green groups, often what they mean is not that it's factually inaccurate, but merely that it's misleading. For instance, one of their examples is that there was a green group that said that 76% of Australia's native forests were vulnerable to logging. And the logging industry's objection was that only 5% of those forests are actually suitable for logging, so that the statistic was quoted out of context. But is it untruthful to quote a statistic out of conteect? Misleading maybe, but false probably not.
Going back to Chaz's great question, is this a sign, Quentin, perhaps of the effectiveness of these campaigns by groups such as GetUp?
Digital media is changing everything. It's not just the big media outfits that are empowered, it's everybody's empowered through Twitter and social media, and they're running their own YouTube video campaigns, and they can reach people of like mind. So there's a gathering. Look at the Lock the Gate campaign right through Australia, or in the CSG areas of Australia. That's a substantial point. But I've got no fear about a robustness of that. If a mining company says your facts are wrong, well, let's have it out, and let the environmentalists come forward and say, no, they're not wrong, this is the facts of it. So you can quickly, particularly now, go to what the probative evidence is for a factual statement, and if we establish that, we can have a robust debate. I don't think anybody should be, in a democracy, should be howled down when they're making substantive points. And if we want an effective democracy, we've got to hear all voices, particularly some very contentious issues with the environmental degradation. And everybody wants the benefits of economic growth. All the politicians are on to about growth, population growth, keeping the consumer economy going. We haven't had a debate about sustainability, economic sustainability with finite resources.
Right, okay, and it's curious that this is the way we've coalesced around the issue in certain segments. Governments
have to deliver growth. I mean, that's their orthodoxy. They say, if we've got manufacturing difficulty now, there's absolute intense pressure on that for the governments to say, I've got this program going and we're going to deliver jobs.
Right. And by the way, let's not forget, the reason that exception is there is because there is no other kind of campaign for the environment other than a secondary campaign. A koala is not going to campaign for itself. A tree is not going to campaign for itself. So if you ruled out secondary campaigns, there would be no environmental campaigns at all.
You're getting emotive now, Chaz.
It's full of
koalas cannot campaign for themselves, that's exactly right. All right, let's go to the US now, because American politics could be set for another huge injection of cash. The US Supreme Court has struck down a Watergate-era limit on campaign donations. Now, this decision was split 5-4, and judges abolished a cap on how many candidates, committees and parties someone can give money to. Many Republicans have welcomed the move.
What I think this means is that freedom of speech is being upheld. You all have the freedom to write what you want to write. Donors ought to have the freedom to give what they want to give.
Democrats fear the decision could be a blow for democracy.
They wish to dismantle all limits on giving, piece by piece, until we are back to the days of the robber barons, when anyone or anything could give unlimited money, undisclosed, and make our political system seem so rigged that everyone will lose interest in our democracy.
Campaign finance has been a hot issue in Australian politics as well this week. The Prime Minister has accused Clive Palmer of trying to buy seats in Parliament with big ad spending for the WA Senate election. But talking about the US first of all, Helen, did you welcome this decision? It was interesting how it seemed to be split along party lines in terms of the response.
I think it's a great decision. I mean, you always see this kind of hysteria. You saw it after Citizens United. But the truth is that the first presidential election after the Citizens United decision, which the Democrats said would wreck politics, elected Barack Obama. So I don't think this hysteria...
What kind of impact do you think it had on that election, though? It was a lot of money being funneled through the super PACs.
That's true. But in this particular, the decision that came this week, it's important to keep in mind that they didn't eliminate all the limits on campaign giving. They only eliminated the aggregate limit. So you can still only give $5,200 per candidate per election.
But you can give it to every candidate in the country. Sorry, Chaz, you're wanting to jump into this. Right. We're talking figures.
No, yes. You're right. Yeah, I mean, the point you're making is correct, that before now there was a limit of about $50,000 to candidates and $75,000 to committees, whereas now you could, if you're clever, you could theoretically get $3.5 million to a bunch of candidates from a single donor if you wanted to. But I think it's really important. I do think Helen's right about the hysteria. It is important to note, as far as people going, oh, now it's unlimited money and all this kind of stuff, that's actually just not true. It's been unlimited money for a long time for super PACs. All this decision does is, like, and the last election we heard about people giving $20 million. Like, that genie is out of the bottle. It's long out of the bottle. What this does is it means that you can give more money to the candidates directly or to the campaign committees directly.
Without going, because the point of Citizens United and the super PACs was they had to appear or to not be affiliated with any party.
Yes, exactly. Yes. But as we know, that was rubbish. Yeah. And so rich people could influence elections already. Right. That has not changed at all. In fact, there is a perverse positive out of this, which is there's going to be more disclosure now. Because with super PACs, there was almost no disclosure at all. And some of them had zero disclosure. Whereas Whereas with parties, they actually have to disclose the donors. So in actual fact, there'll be more transparency theoretically.
So it's a good thing.
Didn't say that.
Yeah.
The other side of it is that the donations will be more direct. They'll be direct to the candidate. And while that in itself is not necessarily an issue, you can see how that could potentially lead to corruption down the road. I don't think the next election is going to be a landslide of trillions of dollars, etc. But you can just see how in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, we might look back on that and go, that was the beginning of a step that led to another step, to led to another step that led to this controversy, whatever it may be down the pike.
Right, but is the question maybe, I mean, I was interested to see the responses of some of the donors was like, oh no, before it was capped at 5, you know, was it 5 or 50?
It was 5, but it's right. They said before we had an answer we could give the candidates who came.
Yeah, we could just say, I've done it to one, I don't have to do it to all of you, but now they're like, oh, I'm going to be sending my kids to community college. I mean, there is a question as well. I mean, if Citizens United didn't change things very much, if you funneled millions and millions of dollars into, you know, the political campaigns, it hasn't had an outcome you've wanted. There is kind of certainly broader questions.
And trying to buy an election with outspending everyone else eventually reaches a point of diminishing returns, because if you're trying to literally buy an election, the voters will notice, your competitors will point out that you're trying to buy an election, and you'll get unpopular because of that. Look at Clive Palmer.
Yeah, I was going to say, on that note, there's been a lot of research on this issue in America, unsurprisingly, and what they tend to find is that trying to buy presidential elections isn't so easy, because what you get, as Helen said, when you get to a certain amount of money, an extra $100 million is not going to make a huge amount of difference. Where money really makes a difference is on the lower levels, when there were the people who don't have so much money.
To get you from here to there, yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. And so that would be more the issue. But having said that, I don't think we should go crazy.
Quentin, what of that? I mean, we did of course have 4 judges dissent on this, and one of them, Justice Bayer, said, where enough money calls the tunes, the general public will not be heard. Do you think this remains a concern, that it can have a distorting effect either there or here in WA? Yes,
if you've got long pockets, you can influence. Look at Clive Palmer. Going from nothing and spending however many millions he did, he's got the balance of power in the Senate from the 1st of July. That's why Tony Abbott's gone on to a direct attack on to try to get that point going. You can't buy elections, just to alert the voters that that's what's in play. Of course, you can spend a lot of money and everybody's onto you, and it may have absolutely no effect, like badly designed ad campaigns that don't hit the mark. They can spend millions, but they can all fall in a heap, and you could waste your dough. I suppose the key thing for what the judicial officers are looking at is if freedom of expression is a more important principle than the corruption risk of party political donations. If that's more important, I think Chaz's point is right. The transparency is the next best thing. Again, we're in the digital revolution, and crowdsourcing of elections where small donations can come in from all across the country if people want to get involved. That's a very positive thing for a robust democracy. And if you can encourage people to get their engagement through that process, that would be fine.
As Obama did. But sorry, I just want to move on, because while we're still in the US, there's some new data out of the Pew Research Centre that's found that attitudes towards illegal drugs are slowly changing. A national survey has revealed that 67% of Americans think that the US administration should focus more on treating, not prosecuting, illegal drug users. Now, 55% of the US population favour the decriminalisation of marijuana use, with 42% opposed. In recent months, we've seen Colorado and Washington approve marijuana for recreational use. Does this signify a different approach to the so-called war on drugs? Helen, I'm going to have to ask you.
I think those numbers are indeed very interesting, but what's even more interesting is that we're starting to see Republican politicians, especially at the state level, beginning to get on board with this idea of first-time offenders being sent to treatment. It's people like Rick Perry in Texas, who some people may remember from the last presidential campaign, and Rand Paul from Kentucky.
Oops. Yes.
Oops, indeed.
right. The seminal moment. What do you think? I mean, some people were surprised this wasn't higher, given that we've had so much publicity about, you know, Colorado and Washington and so on. What do you think's going on, Chaz?
Look, I think Helen is spot on, that the real key is the Republicans getting on board. Because if you have a situation where the Democrats were the ones sponsoring these kinds of moves, it would become political immediately, and all of a sudden there would be a whole bunch of opposition from the Republicans. In the same way as gay marriage, at one point in time had a bit of a split. And when the Democrats started to make it their particular movement, and all of a sudden the numbers stratified. And you could have the same thing happening here. But as long as it's Republicans who are starting to come around, then the Democrats aren't going to go against it. And so you might actually end up having social movement, which would be interesting.
I want the debate to move on to the pharmacology of cannabis, because I did a story a while ago and it's about psychosis and cannabis, because a lot of the cannabis on the market, black market in Australia, is this high concentration THC, which if you're vulnerable, particularly young people, young men and women, if they're vulnerable, can smoke cannabis with high concentration of THC and have a psychotic episode from which they may never recover, or it takes them a long time. We've got a problem with alcohol. Sorry to be a conservative and a party pooper here, but if the debate went on to the therapeutic, the medicinally therapeutic cannabis, and we had our brains around exactly what it was we're going to ingest by a more liberal legalisation process, that would be very beneficial. There are dangers. There are dangers about cannabis and psychosis.
It's interesting because you're right. I mean, there was such a strong swing, according to this research, of people thinking that alcohol is much, much worse for you than marijuana in the US now. Yeah. Although
we should note, as Quentin says, that if you legalise it, you can control it. That's the best way.
Okay, well, let's have a debate about that.
Okay. Coming up next on The Drum, what have the Tea Party got against Barack Obama? We'll talk with political scientist Christopher Parker. Look, it's probably a little too soon to talk about the impact of Barack Obama's presidency, although some do every day. But one thing we can be certain of, his election as the first African-American president coincided with the ascendancy of a remarkable phenomenon in US politics, the Tea Party. The right-wing conservative movement slowly re-emerged after Obama's inauguration in 2009. And now they're a significant player in the American political landscape. Our guest tonight is Christopher Parker, a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington. He's also a visiting fellow at Sydney University's United States Study Centre. In his new book, Professor Parker argues that the Tea Party in the US are fuelled by the fear that America has changed for the worse. The book is called Change They Can't Believe In: The Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America. Professor Parker, welcome to The Drum.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now, you say in your book, Change They Can't Believe In, that it is hard to overestimate the impact of the Tea Party movement on US politics. What exactly has that impact been?
It's been huge. It's really moved the Republican Party significantly to the right. And so what happens is, so where you had Republicans, let me give you an example. So recently, Bob Dole, who was a former Senate Majority Leader, back in the 1990s, he said neither he nor President Reagan would be welcome in today's Republican Party. That's how far the Republican Party shifted to the right, courtesy of the Tea Party. So it's had a huge impact. You have about 50 members of Congress that are in the Republican Party that are in some way, shape, or form affiliated with the Tea Party.
And which particular policy areas you're talking about? There's reproductive rights and abortion, obviously, as well as talk about immigration. Yes.
Immigration, reproductive rights. We can talk about climate change. We can talk about, just any major policy area. Campaign finance reform, not campaign finance reform, but also financial reform writ large, Dodd-Frank. On every major policy issue, they have shifted the Republican Party further and further to the right.
And you say in your book, you argue that they were inspired by Obama's presidency. What is it about that time or about that president?
It's about the change that he represents. It's not Obama as a black man as president. That's not what it's about, really. What it's really about is the president. It really occupies a very important symbolic space in American social and political life. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military. The president is the chief law enforcement officer. The president is the face of the country. The president is the head of government. So we know who the president is from a time we're very little kids. We all know who the president is. So the president is very, very important. So it didn't necessarily have to be Barack Obama. It could have been any non-white male president. It would have had the same impact. It suggests that there's this massive change going on. Anytime you see the emergence of a really extreme, successful national right-wing movement, it is preceded by rapid social change or perceived rapid social change.
And it's about an America that they feel that they've lost track of. What is the America that they harken back to or want to bring back?
You know, I would say mom, apple pie, and Chevrolet, but some of our viewers may not understand that. They
apple
may be a little
pie
too
we
young.
understand very well.
It's about these people, and when I say this, and this is always controversial wherever I say this, but I'm just going to say this: white, mainly male, middle class, middle aged and older, straight, native born. Is that now? I'm not saying everybody from this demographic thinks like this, but if you think about it probabilistically, that seems to be the case. It was the case with the John Birch Society in the early 1960s, late 1950s. It was the same with the Klan of the 1920s. It was the same demographic group when it came to the Know Nothing Party of the 1850s.
Okay, now I do want to ask you a question. I want to bring Helen in because I know that she said before she supports the Tea Party. So before we bring her in, I want to ask you, how representative do you believe the Tea Party is of the average American? Because you talk about 450,000 members, but say that they actually represent 45 million supporters. Is that right?
That's exactly the case. So they're actually, that number since the book came out has increased to 600,000 quote-unquote card-carrying members that are part of one of the major 6 national Tea Party factions. Now, when we refer to the 45 million Americans that are Tea Party supporters, those are folks who strongly support the Tea Party. We're not even including people who somewhat support. We're restricting it. This is a conservative estimate of the people that strongly support the Tea Party but don't consider themselves members necessarily.
So are they representative then? I mean, is this the average American?
It is not the average American. It's not even the average Republican. So only 57% of strong Tea Party supporters identify with the Republican Party. 57%.
That's interesting. So, yeah, sorry, we do need to bring Helen in. But part of the reason I ask you that is because in a lot of reportage of the Tea Party, we do get the more, extreme elements. And some of the more mainstream concerns they have, like government's dysfunctional, Wall Street isn't quite working, would resonate with a lot of people in America.
Of course it would. But let me just say this before, well, maybe Helen's going to anticipate what I'm going to say. Right. But so the Tea Party is supposed to be about fiscal reform, fiscal responsibility, a small regulatory state, all this stuff, right? So where were they when George Bush, blew up, the debt, the budget deficit to 104%? Where were they when TARP went through? Where were they, which was a massive giveaway. So if they're really about, and furthermore, this is the most salient point here, where were they when Bush entered office with a $700 billion surplus and he exited with a $1.3 trillion deficit? That's a $2 trillion swing. We didn't see them then, did we?
Helen, do you want to answer that question? How do you respond to this research?
Well, the place that the Tea Partiers were during the Bush administration was they were seething in their own homes, but they didn't yet have a movement to give voice to that. But the proof that the Tea Party actually is about small government and not about any animus towards the president is that they target establishment Republicans just as much as they do the current president. That's, in fact, the biggest literal political impact they've had at an electoral level.
But does that work with what Christopher was saying about, was it 57%? Only 57% support the Republican Party, so maybe there is just an anti.
Well, no, their attempt is they believe that the establishment Republican Party gave them the Bush budget blowout, and they don't trust them. So now they want to put small government conservatives into the party.
Right. Jazzy.
I was just going to ask Christopher, when we talk about the Tea Party, it's just such an amorphous group. I don't there's such a wide spectrum of voices, and the thing that strikes me is that they essentially at least started off as a protest movement, like a protest movement. I actually disagree with what you're saying about where were they with TARP. I think TARP was part of what spawned the Tea Party, but when Barack Obama started, obviously it ramped up a bit. A
bit?
Yeah, I know. But what I'm saying is, obviously the Tea Party was formed as a protest movement. Whenever you get big protest movements, you attract the disaffected, conspiracy theorists, people who are upset, people who feel they're losing control of their lives, a whole bunch of people who say really stupid things on the internet and carry big banners at Occupy Wall Street. You had plenty of nutters as well. Whenever you get a protest movement, you get the disaffected and nutters. And what I'm wondering is, how much do you feel what you have identified as the Tea Party might be some of the nutters around the Tea Party?
Well, here's the thing. So if we had a small sample with which we were working, then I could roll with you on that. Yeah. But we have a sample of 1,500 interviews that we completed. Of those 1,500, about 20% are strong Tea Party supporters. So you're talking about, and so plus this stuff is supplemented with what's called a content analysis we did comparing Tea Party websites, 42 Tea Party websites in 15 states, to the National Review Online, which I think we would all agree is a conservative standard bearer. I mean, yeah, you got some other publications.
That's where Helen was working, by the way.
The National Review?
Yeah, so let's write off all the other conservative Let's stick with NRO.
So we can agree on something then. So anyway, we bring a wealth of empirical data to this in addition to the theory that we have. And, I mean, people are always trying to argue against this, but they can't argue with the data and the theory. I mean, we can sit up here and discuss things around the margins right now. And yes, there are some of the things you guys say I think is correct, with which I would agree. But what I'm saying is essentially this is about what Obama represents. So it's not him, it's about what he represents. And much to many people's chagrin, the Tea Party is not really mobilizing against race. It's not about race per se. It's about change. If you look at the Klan of the 1920s, not the Klan of the 19th century, not the Klan of the mid-20th century, the Klan of the 1920s was a national political movement. They got the they helped get the Johnson-Reed Act passed in 1924. They also ran the state legislatures in Oregon and in Indiana. Furthermore, they had at least 2 United States senators that were elected with their assistance. 5 million people were part of the Klan of the 1920s. 5 million people. So I'm just saying these things aren't coincidences, right? These things are recurring patterns throughout American history. I can't speak to any other country's history, but I can speak to American history. These things continue to recur and recur over and over again. Go ahead.
Oh, no.
One more question about history.
We have 20 seconds.
Oh, okay. How much do you think the Tea Party are dragging to the right, or how much are they responding to politics dragging to the right? Well, some would say Obama is to the right of Nixon. Like, the whole politics has moved to the right.
Oh, I wouldn't deny that. And that's another sort of misnomer that the Tea Party identifies. They say that, oh, he's a socialist. First of all, I don't think most of them even know what a socialist is, to be honest with you. But beyond that, they say he's a socialist, he's too progressive and all this. But if you look at Obama's record, his policies are actually right down the middle, right in the center.
We are going to have to leave it that right down the middle. Professor Christopher Parker, such a fascinating book. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the invitation.
All for us. Thanks to our panel, Chaz Licciardello, Helen Rittelmeyer and Quentin Dempster. And of course, our guest. You can check out The Drum online, abc.net.au/The Drum. We'll be back again at the same time tomorrow night. We'll see you then.